In this lesson, we're going to talk about the C-sharp coding conventions. So as you start to write C-sharp programs or you're reading other people's code, you'll understand why we write things in a specific way. So if you ask the question, do coding standards exist? Technically, no. Microsoft does not define any C-sharp coding standards. However, guidelines do exist. And Microsoft uses these guidelines to develop samples and documentation that you will find on the MSDN website when you're looking up various ways to use C-sharp code. So while the C-sharp language specification does not actually define a coding standard, the guidelines are helpful in writing clean code that's easy to read and easy to use. So why should we use these coding conventions or these coding guidelines if they're not actually required? Well, coding conventions serve a bunch of really helpful purposes when reading code, when having to maintain it, and if we can keep it consistent across multiple programmers, especially in one programming environment such as a business, then we can always understand what it is that we're trying to say. So, of course, they create kind of that consistent look, right? So if someone is reading your code, they can focus on the content and not the layout. And this is especially true if the layout is poor. So if the code's all smushed together, it becomes hard to read, and it becomes a much more tedious process for someone not familiar with the code to then suddenly have to read it and bring themselves up to speed. Using coding conventions allows readers to understand the code more quickly, and so they can make assumptions based on previous experience with how it looks. Facilitates in copying, changing, and maintaining the code, since a lot of our code has to go through many years of maintenance to keep it up to date, to change and add new features as the needs of the business change. So writing the code is not the be-all, end-all of C-sharp development. We have to think about the long term. And so writing code correctly the first time that not only works and solves the problem but looks nice will help us cut down on problems later when we're having to maintain that code. And then the best practices as outlined by Microsoft are held in those C-sharp coding conventions. So if you're using those, then you are following the guidelines that Microsoft does recommend for writing C-sharp code. So there's many types of conventions, and we're going to talk about some of them here, and in the next video you're going to see some examples of some of these conventions. But there are naming conventions, so how we should name variables and methods and classes. Layout conventions, since good layout and good formatting kind of emphasize the structure of your code and make it easier to read, there are several guidelines that Microsoft recommends to follow when laying out the code. There are commenting conventions, so how we should place comments, where they should go, how they should be formatted, and kind of where they should ultimately be placed inside of our code. And then there's many language guidelines. And so these guidelines kind of are specific to how the C-sharp syntax works, whereas the previous conventions could be applied to any programming language. The language guidelines are really specific to C-sharp. So we'll go through in the next video and look at some examples of some of these guidelines. So as you are working through this course, you can start to implement these guidelines and develop good habits from the start.